So why would you crank the ISO up on your camera to ridiculous numbers like 51,200? I'm going to tell you on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. If you've got photo questions, you know what to do. You go to askdavidbergman.com, submit your own question right there on that site. I just might pick it to answer here on a future show. Also, you probably know I'm doing my live concert photography workshops all around the United States this fall. I hope you'll check that out at shootfromthepit.com. You join me at a real live arena concert. It's a super fun time. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. And then that night, you're going to shoot the show, the entire show. It's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Go to shootfromthepit.com and check that out. And I hope to see you out on the road. All right, I've got a question sent in from Elna G. And Elna wants to know, I have the Canon 7D Mark II and would like to know when a person would use the expanded ISO settings like H1, 25,600, or H2, 51,200. Elna, thanks so much for sending in that question. I really appreciate it. Before I get to that answer, I need to talk for a second about something. This is a pet peeve of mine. I've mentioned it before, and I'm going to bring it up again. You may have noticed I use the phrase ISO. I don't say ISO. And actually, the truth is, it's not an acronym. It is a word. I know that's a big debate in the photo community, but believe me, it is an actual word. If you go to ISO.org, which is the International Organization for Standardization, they actually came up with the term, and on their About page, there's a little box that says it's all in the name. And what it says is, because International Organization for Standardization would have different acronyms in different languages, iOS in English, OIN in French for Organisation Internationale de Normalisation, our founders decided to give it the short form ISO. ISO is derived from the Greek isos, meaning equal. Whatever the country, whatever the language, we are always ISO. So you can go check that out for yourself. They said it right there from the horse's mouth. So I know it's tricky to get used to. I said ISO for years, but it is actually ISO. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, what does ISO actually do? What does that setting actually do? Well, I'm going to back up a little bit here. You probably know it's one of the settings in the exposure triangle. And what exposure is, simply enough, it's the brightness or darkness of your image. So when we talk about the exposure triangle, the three settings that affect the brightness of your image are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, aperture and shutter speed are different from ISO in that they are actually physical adjustments that change the number of photons that are hitting the sensor in your camera. The shutter speed is the curtain that opens that changes the amount of light that's coming in, and the aperture is how wide that lens opening is to let more or less light in. So those are physical things that happen that change how much light is actually coming through. Now, the thing about the exposure triangle, it's always a give and take. So if you give one place, you have to take it somewhere else. So you might actually hit some limits with aperture and shutter speed. Let's say, for example, you want your shutter speed to be fast to freeze action, but maybe it's nighttime or it's just too dark for whatever reason, even with your aperture wide open, but you want to get that fast shutter speed. Now, back in the film days, you would use different ASA films. You would use 800 ASA film. They always said that was indoor film. And what that was, it was a higher sensitivity film that would allow you to use a faster shutter speed because the sensitivity of the film is much higher in 800 than at 100 or 200. Nowadays, we can simply bump up the ISO on our camera instead of changing rolls of film. Now, what ISO is, it's a post-processing that happens inside the camera. It actually boosts up the brightness of the image after the light is already captured by the digital sensor. Really what it is, in the video world, they call that gain. And it's really the same thing. It's the gain of the sensor. So it's a post-processing kind of a trick to just make the image look brighter, even though it's collected the same amount of data, the same amount of light. Now, the higher the number, the brighter the image is going to get. So the downside, however, is as you get higher, it actually adds noise into the image, digital noise. Now, that noise is going to be more prominent in the darker areas of the image, and the reason is light is data for your camera. So the more light it has, the more meat the camera has to chew on to create your image. I'll give you an example. If I shot a picture of myself in a completely dark room and the image was just completely black, and then I tried to boost up the exposure afterward, if there's no data there, there's no light collected, the camera can't possibly know how to draw my face, right? So it's just going to try to guess. And when it does that, it gets noisy. It's just trying to figure out what to put in there, but it doesn't really know. If it has some brightness, some light in there, you can always sort of bring it down a little bit if you overexpose, but trying to bring it up, you're really going to gather some noise. So ISO, you're going to see that noise more in the shadows than in the brighter areas. Now, Elna, your specific question, ISO at the low end, we're talking numbers like 100, 200, 400. Those, you're really not going to see any noise in that. And most cameras, you can go really, really high, up to things like 12,800 and even higher. But however, you really need to test your camera for the highest usable ISO, right? So the camera companies say the highest ISO is 51,000 whatever. That may or may not be usable for your situation. Each camera is a little bit different, and what I call the highest usable ISO, you really have to test for yourself to see what's acceptable to you, because it's a bit of a creative decision. You also have to factor in how you're using those images. If it's going to be a coffee table book, then you really want the highest possible quality. If it's just going to be on Instagram at 3 inches wide, I wouldn't worry about it that much, because you're really not going to see that much noise. Now, each generation of camera gets better and better. In my experience, it gets one stop better roughly with each generation as far as quality of the ISO. For me, I'm a Canon shooter, so the original 1DX, the Mark I, 3200 was about as high as I really like to go to have a usable image with an acceptable amount of noise. The 1DX Mark II, I felt like 6400 was where I wanted to be at its highest. And the 1DX Mark III that I'm using now, I shoot 12,800 all the time, and it really looks good, especially with that 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens. That's a 5.6 aperture at the long end. I really need that high ISO to be able to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action. Now, Canon, Elna, as you mentioned, has those other two settings, H1, High 1, and High 2, and those are essentially 25,600 and 51,200. Now, again, just because you can shoot that high doesn't mean you actually should. I personally never use it that high. It really doesn't look that good, even small on social media. Personally, I'm not a particular fan of that. I don't do it in that way. However, if you have no other choice, maybe you need that extra couple of stops to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action. I would bump it up for that reason, especially if the images are only going to be small, like on social media. For example, this picture of John Bon Jovi I shot a few years ago on the original 1DX, the Mark I. It was super dark, and he was only being lit by his cell phone. I was already down at an 80th of a second and really didn't want to go any slower than that because I was hand-holding and didn't want to have motion in the image. I was also at 2.8, which was the widest aperture I could shoot on that particular lens. My ISO, I pushed it all the way up to 10,000. That's almost 2 stops higher than my highest preferred ISO for that camera, the original 1DX Mark I, which was really 3,200. Now, looking at it here on YouTube, it looks fine. If you zoom all the way in, you can see the noise in that background. But guess what? Photographers are the only ones who are going to do that. They're the only ones who care about noise in the photographs. Nobody looking at the picture is going to pinch in to zoom and say, oh, look at the noise in the background there. It's just not going to happen. Some of the greatest historical film images are really noisy. They didn't have high-speed film available, so what they'd do is they'd overprocess the film to pull details out of the shadow area. They often looked really bad, but nobody cares. If it's a great image that grabs somebody's attention, the technical issues don't matter at all. Personally, I'd rather not have much noise if I can do it in today's world. I want it to be as technically correct as possible. But if shooting at crazy high ISOs is the difference between getting the shot or not, I'm going to take the noise every single time. So, Elna, I hope that answers your question. Thanks so much for sending it in. Remember, you guys can send your own questions in at AskDavidBergman.com. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, make sure you click that button down below. Use the little bell icon. You'll be notified as soon as new shows come out all week long. And I'm back here every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, with a brand new question. I hope you'll join me next week right here on Ask David Bergman.